We've arrived now at the final chapter of John's Gospel, chapter 21. It's about the miraculous catch of fish and Jesus' third appearance to the disciples after his resurrection. I'm reading from chapter 21, verse 1 down to verse 14. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. "I'm going out of fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and they got into a boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. And then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It's the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it, and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you've caught." Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. And this was now the third time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So here we have a kind of an epilogue to John's Gospel. It's rather been questioned as to whether this was originally part of John's Gospel, simply on the basis that the end of John chapter 20 seems to be the kind of the closing part of the Gospel. It's like in John 20 verse 30, Jesus did many other miraculous signs in his presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, that by believing you may have life in his name. It's as if that's a kind of natural ending for the book, almost as if John had said, "I'm finished there." But then, maybe later on, there is this additional section put in. That's speculation. No one really knows, and that last passage in John 20, although it does have the feeling of being the end of a gospel, there is certainly this extra chapter, chapter 21. There aren't any manuscripts that anyone's aware of that doesn't have John 21, so it's not likely that this is put in by another person. It has the authentic feel of being written by John, and I think that one shouldn't even think that verse chapter 21 is not authentic. It has certainly the ring of authenticity about it. And it may well be that for some reason or other, John decided that, he had some extra pages to write, some more paper, he had some more ink, and he would put together some final thoughts for us to think about. It may well be, too, that there's a specific reason why he chose the stories which he did, because there are essentially this event about the catching of the fish, which then naturally leads into the reinstatement of Peter, which we'll look at in another talk. And then after that, there's the final section where John deals with himself and with the rumours that were going on about that he would live forever. There seems to be that rumour in the church, and that's something which I think John wanted to put right here also in the final chapter. So let's look at verse 1. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. The Sea of Tiberias is the modern name for the Sea of Galilee. So we're back up north. We're in the north of the country. It's a day's walk or so to go from Jerusalem to Nazareth and to Galilee and that kind of an area. But all the events of the resurrection had taken place in Jerusalem. They had been there for some time. Elsewhere it says that Jesus would go ahead of them and meet them in Galilee and in Nazareth. And they then went as a group, it seems to me, at least a group of 7 here, and maybe all the disciples went north to Galilee. And it so happened in this way. So we have 7 disciples named specifically out of the 11 that were left. There was Simon Peter. He's listed first, and I think that's important because he was clearly thought of, even despite the fact that he had denied Jesus 3 times, and therefore was somewhat suspect amongst the disciples, and amongst anyone who read the story, no doubt, that nevertheless he was still considered leader, and he had the natural leadership qualities, as we'll see in a moment. Then there was Thomas, called Didymus, the outspoken, doubting person who wanted the empirical evidence that we've heard before. Then we've got Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, so he was headed back home that way. The sons of Zebedee, they're never mentioned by name, James and John, and 2 of the other disciples were together who are not named, and we don't know who they are. You have a group of people here who have gone north, and the thing which strikes you about them is that now that Jesus has left them, they seem entirely purposeless. They seem a purposeless, aimless group of men who are not sure what to do next. Jesus has said he would meet them up in Galilee. They've gone up, and maybe they're waiting. Maybe they're waiting for something or some other sign or some other knowledge. Jesus has just given them a commission, but for some reason or other, they are uncertain as to how to proceed or what to do. Like a flock of sheep, they are leaderless. Jesus no longer present with them all the time, and his appearances are spasmodic and unregular. And what we've got then is a group of people who don't really know, it seems to me, what to do for the best or what to do next. Even Peter is unsure of what to do. And so it's not surprising that you find this group of men at a loose end, and suddenly Simon Peter says, I'm going out to fish. And which seems like a retrograde step, because this is going back to their old ways, back to the things which they used to do, back to their day job. They still had a boat, they still had things, but the kind of idea behind this is the kind of, we're sitting around here doing nothing. Let's go and do something, and I'm going to go out to fish because I'm fed up of sitting around here. That's the kind of feeling that this has. And here again is the leadership quality of Peter. Peter is the one who makes the impetus, who makes the decision, who decides what he's going to do, and the others follow. And that's what leaders do. They have a clear idea of what they're going to do. They make a decision what they're going to do. They do it, and others follow what the leader does. Important for the leader to make decisions about things and to set out and to do things regardless of whether others follow him. He's not made that decision simply because he wants to lead others to do something, that's his choice. And if you want to be with me, come and follow me. Well, that's what they do. And it says, and they say, we'll go with you. So having made the decision, they then follow on with another decision. I think that's an important principle of leadership. A leader is someone who knows what he wants to do. A leader is someone who can make those kinds of decisions, and a leader is someone who is not simply waiting around for other people to do things. Not everyone has that quality of leadership, but certainly Simon Peter had it by nature. Whether the others followed him or not, he knew what he was going to do and he was going to do it. And that kind of character of knowing what you want to do and being able to execute it and plan it without necessarily other people being involved, but you've got your plan, will automatically draw others to yourself. People who are certain, who understand what they're going to do and have a plan to do something, attract others. And that's the nature of leadership, it seems to me. Leadership is more than just management or organization. It's to do with knowing what you need to do or what you have to do, getting on and doing it, and seeing if it attracts other people along. Peter was in that position, and that's partly why, by his very nature, I think it's recognized by all, and particularly by Jesus, that he is the one who will be needed to feed the sheep and the lambs. Early in the morning, so they went out and got into a boat, and that night they caught nothing. Apparently it's still the custom today that fishermen in the Sea of Galilee go out either at the hours of early morning or early dusk at night time. Whether that's to do with the movement of fish, it's difficult to say, I'm not sure, but all I can say is that that's still the custom today. So this going out to fish was a night-term experience, which takes them probably, we're looking here at around about 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, and maybe 6 o'clock when they're out fishing, maybe 3 o'clock in the morning, maybe when they start to go out. And so when he made that statement, they would have had to have got up and gone out at that time and made plans to do so. And that was something which Peter had engendered. They spent some hours fishing and finding nothing. Probably not an unusual occurrence, but one which was deeply disappointing. They had caught nothing. Early in the morning, so it's first light, the sun has just come up. They're probably thinking of heading back to the shore. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. So they're about 100 yards out. 100 yards is not that far. You can easily see people on the shore from that distance. And the fact that it says they did not recognize Jesus means that it wasn't one amongst many people. There's just one person on the shore here. There's just one character that they see. While they're out fishing, as the light comes up, they probably wonder who it is. They probably can't see someone distinctly enough from 100 yards to see or to work out who that person would be. But there's someone on the shore, and it looks like they are setting up a fire and going to have breakfast with some fish. Where the fish came from is not said. But early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus, which is not surprising, as I say, being 100 yards away. But here, the man on the shore calls out something. He says, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" Apparently, the better translation, a more accurate translation, is "children, haven't you anything to eat?" Because the term friends is really a diminutive term for younger people, children. Haven't you anything to eat? It wasn't specifically about fish, but fish is understood there. Haven't you anything to eat? Understanding then that the purpose of fishing was to get something to eat, obviously, and not just for commercial reasons. Children, haven't you anything to eat? That must have been an unusual statement for them to hear. And you can cast your voice about 100 yards over water, but you'd really have to shout to do that. And so here is a man on the shore who is seeing the people, and they see him, and he shouts, "Children, haven't you anything to eat?" He's preparing his own food. It's an implicit invitation here. And they say no. They don't know who he is, but they're responding to his request in a simple kind of way. Must have been a little bit odd to consider that this stranger on the shore is addressing them as children. Normally maybe friends, normally maybe, "Hey, fisherman, have you got anything to eat? Have you caught any fish?" And it speaks of the isolation also of probably just one boat out there fishing, one person on the shore, no one else around. That's the kind of picture, and the sun having just come up. What was Jesus doing there? Impossible to say, other than to say maybe because he knew that the disciples were out in the boat and he wanted to see them. They say no. So we get this strange reply. Well, they must have thought it strange anyway to be addressed as children, but it represents the relationship of Jesus to the disciples. And it must have been a word which might trigger some understanding of who this person might be. This is someone who is speaking to them as a father would to children. Someone who is clearly on a more parental, governing level of someone who is looking at them as sheep, as children, as those who need help and understanding that he can provide. And that must have raised some questions. So he said, "Throw your net on the other side of the boat and you will find some." No, I'm not a fisherman. I don't know if people from the shore can see shoals of fish moving around. Certainly probably not from 100 yards. One couldn't do so. The request would have been considered unusual, maybe even bizarre. How is it likely that you can catch fish on one side of a boat, but you can't catch fish on the other side of the boat when the shoals of fish are moving around all over the place? If we take it as a simple idea that maybe you could see shoals of fish from where you stand, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Some people have suggested this, but it doesn't make any sense to me, because if you can see it from the shore where the shoals of fish are, you could certainly see it from the boat, because the angle would be much more clear and direct. So here's a request which doesn't make any sense. The person on the shore can't see any more clearly or less clearly than someone else can. And one would not expect to find fish on one side rather than the other. In fact, the request would be considered ludicrous or even ridiculous, one would think. It's not a standard practice amongst fishing that if you fish on one side of the boat with all the nets on one side and you didn't have any luck, that you put them on the other side. That's not a standard approach to fishing. So the request is one which is bizarre, which is unusual, and which must have provoked initially some kind of response of, why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense. That's stupid. But notice this. Instead of saying, that's ridiculous, we're not doing that, thank you very much, how can that help? For some reason, they take that on board. And I think that there's something here already beginning to manifest itself. They've seen Jesus twice already in the locked room. And they have understood that something supernatural has occurred in the resurrection of this man. But he comes and he goes for some time. And they don't always see him, and they're not with in his presence constantly. He comes and goes just as appearances allow. And here is another occasion when, who is this? Who is this who addresses us as children? And it must have been in the back of someone's mind here. There's something special about this person and who calls us children. It would have been Simon Peter, I suppose, who made the decision to move the nets to the other side of the boat, despite the fact that it could make no real difference. But in doing so, what they show is a faith and a willingness to obey the stranger on the shore. The stranger on the shore, someone who they are uncertain of, but who is raising questions. Who would ask to do something like that? But we've seen many miracles in our time with Jesus. We don't know who this guy is, but it must have raised it in their heads. So they give it a go. And maybe under the direction of Peter, who's the leader, they hauls the net in, take it across the boat, and cast it out onto the other side. And before a moment or two has gone by, it says, when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. There's a recognition here that something miraculous has taken place. They feel the tug on the net. It's swarmed with fish, and they seek to haul it in, and there were so many they can't even get the net into the boat. It's not like they've got 10, 15, 20 fish, which might be the normal catch. They've got over 100. And that's not normal, the size of the catch. It's not normal that they would get such a huge catch, despite the fact not having any before, just by putting the net on the other side. Something remarkable has happened. It says here, the disciple whom Jesus loved, John, said to Peter, "It's the Lord." And the recognition comes from two things, it seems to me. The miraculous event of the fish, having carried out the will of Christ by an act of pure faith, and nothing other than pure faith, because it goes against reason. And the fact that he called them children earlier on. John puts more than 2 and 2 together to find a correct answer, and says to Peter, his views have been realized, and he says to him and articulates them, it's Jesus, it's the Lord, as they call him, the Lord. And Peter, true to his nature, immediately he heard that, it says he heard them say, it's the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it's the Lord, he didn't need any further information. He wrapped his outer garment around him, for he'd taken it off. It's only the outer garment, so he stripped for work, puts his arm, and then jumps into the water. He's not cared about getting it wet, but, and interestingly enough, he probably was worried about getting it wet while he was busy working. but he was going to get to that stranger in the shore as fast as he possibly could. He'd been deprived of the presence of his Lord for a week or so. And you can see the connection. The huge desire to be in the presence of Jesus is overpowering, particularly for someone as impetuous as Peter. He wrapped his garment round him, jumped into the water, and made his way as fast as he could, swimming and then running through the shallowed part of the water to get to Jesus first. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish because they couldn't haul it on board. And they were about 100 yards away, 200 cubits, it says, which cubits about half a yard. And when they landed, Peter was already there. And they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. So breakfast had been commenced. This was a meeting. This was someone who had come and wished to have breakfast early in the morning and to engage with the disciples in a deliberate act there. Jesus said to them as they arrived, "Bring some of the fish that you've just caught." This is not an occasion for the multiplication of bread and fish as it was earlier on. There is no need for miracles when you have all the means available to you. Everything was available to them. The fish had just been caught and captured, and that was sufficient. It might have been an interesting idea that, and some people suggested that this is a multiplication of loaves and fishes for a third time because it's happened twice previously. However, as I say, miracles are not required, it seems to me, when natural events will do. And so Jesus said to them, "Bring the fish that you have." And they do. And it says that Simon Peter climbed aboard, so he was on the shore with Jesus, recognized who he was, climbed back onto the boat and helped to drag the net in. And it was full of large fish. It says 153, but even with so many, the net was not torn. A lot of ink has been spilt on trying to explain the number 153. Some people say that it is the sum of the numbers from 1 to 17. And if you add 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 all together up to the number 17, you get 153. A mathematical interesting anomaly, or it's a triangular number. If you put all the numbers 153 in a triangular form, that's what you will find. You can put it in that thing. However, although I've seen some remarkably elaborate and in many ways fanciful and fantastic explanations of 153 as to what it meant. Some people have said that there were 153 different types of fish known in the sea at that time, and therefore the 153 represents everybody and everything, then therefore the universality of the fishers of men and the gospel going out. I have to say that none of those things I find in the least bit persuasive. In fact, I find them rather ludicrous. In which case I'm left with the question, why 153? And my answer is rather simple. That there were, in fact, 153 large fish in the net. It's as simple as that. We're not meant to read into things like a kind of numerology and put information into the scriptures which are not there. Fundamental principle, I would say, of interpretation. Don't add things to the Bible, rather take the things out from the Bible. What can you take out of 153? Well, you can take out that it was a large number of fish and that the net was not broken, and that large number of fish was indicative of the fact that Jesus had performed a substantive miracle in simply getting them to move the net from one side of the boat to the other. It wasn't a half-hearted kind of approach. It didn't pick up half a dozen fish. 153. Something stupendous had occurred by an inconsiderable act of meaninglessness. But because they had faith in Christ, they did what he said, the results were huge. 153. And someone had actually counted them. They probably counted them because it was unusual to get that many fish. It may well be that they always counted very large numbers coming out from the sea to see what their largest number was, whether it was a record or not. Was it a record catch? It might well have been so. 153 is the number, and it was produced by a miraculous intervention on the behalf of Jesus. But even with so many, the net was not torn, which is maybe also considered by some to be miraculous. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now, none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" This provides us with another problem. On almost all the occasions when Jesus appears, when he first appeared to Mary of Magdala, he wasn't recognized. Some people have read into that the idea that somehow or other Jesus, after the resurrection, looked somewhat different. And that raises all kinds of questions. If he looked different, was he the same person? We've been assured that he was indeed exactly the same person, even though he may have looked different in some respect, because the evidence is that he had the nail prints in his hands and the spear thrust in his side, and that evidence, that empirical evidence demanded by Thomas, identifies him as identically the same person, despite the fact that his appearance seems different. Or it could simply be that they are not expecting something. We see, as I said earlier on, we see what we expect to see, and we don't see what we expect not to see, even though it might be in front of us. That's human nature, the way we prepare ourselves for that. But whatever the reason, and we're not really given the reason, they weren't entirely sure who it was. The signs were there. The terminology of children, the miraculous catch of fish, the way in which he spoke to them and dealt with them. But there is no doubt that this was indeed Jesus himself. But the other important thing that we learn from that is they didn't dare. Now, what's behind that word, they didn't dare to ask him? Well, there is a fear of a rebuke from Jesus. Jesus did not hold back in giving rebukes to different people. When Philip last spoke to him and said, show us the Father, there was a rebuke that followed that. How can you say, show us the Father, when have you not been with me long enough to realize that I and the Father are one? There's a rebuke to Judas. There's a rebuke in different. So there's a kind of a natural hesitancy in the presence of someone with such a strong and commanding personality that you don't want to find yourself on the wrong side of that. There's that kind of feel to it as well. But also they didn't dare, possibly because they didn't want to show any lack of faith in the resurrection. Well, they'd seen him already. They'd seen him twice before. And he'd appeared, this is now the third time, the third appearance. They didn't wish to question that, because to question it would show a lack of faith. How can you be Jesus when we saw you crucified? How can you be alive when we saw you dead? It goes against everything that we understand. And there's a big barrier here, which is prevents people from fully accepting the resurrection. Why? Because it is against all physical laws that we know, all experience that we know. It's against the principle of induction. Everyone who dies stays dead. The next person who dies stays dead. And here was an exception that seems to flout that rule. How can we understand that? No, they didn't dare to challenge Jesus. They were intimidated, I suppose, maybe too strong a word, but they were wary of this character on the shore who was clearly miraculous, who had a commanding authority, who referred to them as children, who could produce quantities of fish by an inconsequential act of moving a net from one side of a boat to the other. And they're in the presence of someone extraordinary. So they knew it was the Lord. Maybe that's another reason why they didn't ask, because they knew it was him. But there's that word of dare. They didn't dare ask because they knew it was the Lord. There's more than simply knowing it was him, therefore they didn't need to ask. It's they didn't dare ask for the reasons which I've mentioned. And Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them. And he did the same with the fish. That is an echo of the breaking of the loaves and the fishes. There is an element here of something that has been done before, but without the miraculous content. Jesus naturally acting as the superintendent, the one in charge, the person in control who does the distribution. And that also will have given them a very clear understanding from what they'd seen before, from the Last Supper, from the way in which he handled the food and gave that out at the miracles of the loaves and fishes. Here is an echo of that without the miraculous part of it. Again, stating clearly by his actions who he is. Well, they didn't have any doubt. It said they knew it was the Lord, and this was now the third time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. We might ask, in closing, what's the purpose of this particular appearance? And I come back to the start at the beginning. This is a purposeless group of men whose only activities now left them to go back to what they did before. And Jesus is seeking here to remind them that they have another purpose. And they will have another leader now, not Jesus himself, but Simon Peter. And this move to direct them and to focus their attention and to give them back the purpose which they seem to have forgotten is part of these final resurrection appearances. And we'll see how that happens next time.